Hello and welcome to the Preserving History and Democracy podcast. I'm Communications Coordinator Cynthia Mendoza, and I am joined with our wonderful producer Bernadine Caparel. How are you, Bert?
Hi, good morning. How are you?
I'm doing great. We got another great topic ahead of us today.
Yes, we do.
And we got an incredible guest as well. Do you want to go ahead and introduce our guest and our topic? Of
course. Okay, today we're going to be speaking with special guest Dr. Peter Kopp, who is the Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies and co-director of Public History Program in the Department of History at the University of Colorado, Denver, and author of Hoptopia, one of our favorite topics, A World of Agriculture and Beer in Oregon's Willamette Valley. Peter is joining us from Denver via Zoom, and we thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and speak with us about our local hero, Fabian Garcia.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So before we jump in, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know Bern kind of mentioned some of your work, but can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
I'm a historian. I have a PhD in history, and I've taught history for almost 20 years. I'm originally from Portland, Oregon, and I do the history of where I live. So my first book is the history of the hop and beer industry in Oregon in the Willamette Valley. I was a professor of history at New Mexico State for almost 10 years, and that's where I started my research on Fabian Garcia, and I'm writing a book and an article and working with some colleagues still at New Mexico State to do some historical markers and a historic trail. We know where, well, I can tell you more about that later. Anyway, so that's what I'm wrapping up right now. I'm a historian, and I write about place, and I figure out what's interesting about that place. And then I try to use that as a hook to tell deeper stories.
Awesome.
Well, we found a very interesting character today to talk about,
Yes,
Fabian
excited.
Garcia. Can you tell us what his early life was like?
Garcia's life was marred with tragedy, familial tragedies. He was born an orphan in Chihuahua, in 1872. His adoptive parents died when he was 2 years old, and his grandmother, Jacoba, then moved him north to the Gila Mountain region, where she was a domestic. She cleaned houses and took care of houses and stuff like that. The most important thing to know about Garcia's childhood is that he never got a proper education. He was illiterate. He lived in the Gila Mountain mining district. There was lots of people from Chihuahua, miners, domestics, and some farmers and such, but there wasn't regular schooling. And so it's not till Garcia is brought in by the Casad family in Mesilla that he even learns the English language, maybe 3 or 4 years before he went to NMSU. So
Wow, that's something.
Yeah.
an important part of his story is how he overcame the tragedy of his youth to become quite an important character.
And the Casads were well-to-do?
The Casads were wealthy folks from the Midwest. They came to the borderlands via California. It's really important so the Casads live in Mesilla. They were the largest orchardists in the region, and so it's very important. The patriarch Thomas Casad was dying, and so that's when the matriarch Sarah hires Jacoba and brings her and Fabian in as part of the family, basically. So during his teenage years, not only does Garcia receive his first proper education, he also receives schooling in the real world on the largest orchard in the area. And so he fell in love with agriculture, and particularly horticulture, taking care of fruits and specialty crops like nuts and pecans and all that stuff. So he had these. So a really important part of his childhood was that his grandmother Jacoba took very good care of him, but then Sarah Casad took him in too. So he had these two strong women in his life that totally shaped who he would become.
So what was his time as a student like?
There's a lot of records at New Mexico State from his college years. So he was part of the first graduating class of what was then called New Mexico A&M from 1890 to 1894. He was the only student of color during that time period. He was only one of two college students at the university from Mexico during the entire first decade. This is all to say that he inhabited a white world, and Las Cruces elite and the college were very white at the time. And so this was this is an important part of the story. When I first was working on this book, I really wanted to focus on just the environmental story and agricultural story, but this story is fundamentally about race and overcoming racism in his life. He was well loved by everybody. He was gregarious, outgoing, just a good person. He played on the football team. He was part of the literary societies, but he was surrounded by a racist world. In those literary societies, they would have debates on whether Hispanic races were civilized or not. And he was sitting in the same room as these students who were debating, are Hawaiians civilized? Are Mexicans civilized? Are Puerto Ricans civilized? And remember, this is the 1890s. And there's no record. He leaves no record behind about how he felt about that. But what we see in the following, what we see in the student records is that when it was his turn to come up with an idea for a lecture, a talk during those college years, his would be the significance of the Spanish language in New Mexico, or the importance of Mexican cuisine, or these important things. So in other words, when it was his turn, he turned it on its head to celebrate diversity as opposed to living in a very racist world in that historical moment, where, as we know, was the reason that New Mexico didn't even become a state from 1850 to 1912. It was a territory because people in Congress did not think that New Mexicans were worthy or civilized enough to become included in statehood. So that experience too shapes his career. And I'm spending a lot of time talking about that because I'm trying to set up what he does later in his life too.
You know, he was already like a hero to me, Fabian Garcia, but knowing that he came from such a struggle, and my family's from Chihuahua too, so it's really incredible to know that he has a history of, some struggles, but he made it, and hey, he's one of the most iconic people in our place now, so it's pretty awesome.
I like the way he turned it on its head, though. That's a very, I don't want to say passive aggressive, but it's so smart.
Yeah. So smart. A good friend of mine once said he of course he didn't bring up racism. He had to negotiate a white world, but he did so in a very smart way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
He's probably one of the most iconic people now, so hey.
So was he a teacher after his time at the university?
Not quite. So he graduates in 1894 and he's hired immediately. The other students in the graduating class go off and they do summer vacations. He wanted to get to work. So he was hired in May of 1894 as an assistant agriculturalist in the agricultural experiment station that is an important part of NMSU today, still obviously. And so his first work that's when he becomes a professional scientist, and he plants all kinds of test crops all across where New Mexico State is today. Dozens and dozens of varieties of crops. He's reading literature from around the world to see how other people farm and innovate in arid climates. He's doing all this legwork that builds up to the 1900s when he takes over the experiment station. So I can't remember if I sent you guys the PowerPoint that I did for NMSU. Anyway, there's a great map of where that garden is. It was the college farm, I should say. And they're growing all pecans and nut trees and wheat and rye and oats, but they have all these specialty crops, including hops, which I thought was pretty cool.
That is cool.
And they're growing eggplants and all this stuff. And so pepper, and there's a row of peppers too. And today in Las Cruces, it's where where the hotel is by the convention center. That's where the original college farm was, and that's where he grew his first peppers in 1894. So we're trying to get a historical plaque or marker there. It's kind of out of the way, so that's one of the problems. The work he does during this period, during the rest of the 1890s, is remarkable because it helps create modern farming in New Mexico. He doesn't miss any days of work. And in 1899, the college says, "You haven't missed any days of work since you started in 1894. We'd like to pay for you to take a sabbatical and go study graduate school somewhere for a year." And so I'm not sure how he ended up there, because all the letters I saw, he was like, "Well, I'll say hello from Wisconsin." Anyway, he ends up in New York, in upstate New York, where you're from, Bern. Wait, where are you from again?
I'm actually from the city, but I lived upstate for a little bit, so.
Okay, so he ends up at Cornell. And Cornell is the hotbed of agricultural research during that time period. And it's led by an individual named Liberty Hyde Bailey, who was a celebrity across the US because he was introducing all kinds of new crops. This is something I write about that's really important, and Garcia fits the story too, because he's going to mirror Bailey. During this time period, we don't have TVs. We don't have radios. People go to lectures for fun, and it wasn't as an exciting life as we have now. But what's more exciting than having access to new foods and ingredients from across the world that you can grow in your backyard, and that Garcia and Bailey and others are going to eventually crossbreed so that they fit your environment, which is where the story of the chili pepper comes from. But what's more exciting than bringing that kind of change where you can literally taste and smell things that you never had access to before? What's more, in New Mexico, summers in New Mexico, I heard it was particularly hot this year in Las Cruces. I haven't visited this year. He introduces all kinds of shade trees and bushes and shrubs to provide shade during the summertime. And he's looking at crops from around the world to see how other people have innovated. He introduces those to the region. He introduces flowers and bushes and annuals and perennials and all kinds of pretty stuff that didn't exist there to begin with. He makes life on the borderlands more enjoyable. Whereas the chili pepper was a small part of his research identity, he spent the first decade of his career learning about agriculture, modern agriculture, going to work in Cornell, which was the hotbed of agricultural studies, where he got a network from that point on for the rest of his career. For the next 40 years, he would be networked with those people. He became part of the intellectual elite of the country because he was able to spend a year there. If you ask people in New York if they've heard about Fabian Garcia, people would say no. It's my goal to change that. I want his story to be part of every K through 12 history curriculum that looks at this time period, because he was so important. This leads me to the argument of my book. Garcia not only spent his childhood and his college years facing racism and understanding that white elites in New Mexico and from the East Coast disparaged people of Mexican descent and people of color and indigenous people. He also saw that they disparaged the landscape as the same. They used the same language for the landscape that they did for people. This is an uncivilized place. This is a backwards place. These are uncivilized people. These are backward people. So what does he do with his career? He changes the story by changing the physical landscape itself.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
That is amazing to think that if you change the landscape, you therefore change the people.
So he introduces modern agriculture. People are making more money. He brings attention to the college. He makes the desert bloom with all kinds of new um, beautiful plants. When you walk across Mesilla Park today or downtown Las Cruces, some of those trees go back to Garcia. And it's not just Las Cruces, you guys. You walk to any other town on the borderlands, Garcia and his proteges chose the plants to plant on the main streets. They chose the crops that people are growing. When you encounter non-native species and improved native species, those all go back to Garcia. My argument is that he changed the botany of the borderlands. It's a different place today, going back to this one remarkable individual.
How was the Chile landscape kind of here in the borderland before Fabian Garcia?
So Chiles go back centuries, right? They came up through Latin America, ended up in the New Mexico borderlands regions. But they were always different. Every family had a different chili variety because they're what we call land races. Land races are plants that adapt to certain environmental conditions, and they might crossbreed in the wild and kind of end up differently on someone else's farm. Before Garcia came around, there wasn't a way to market and sell those. They were much smaller peppers. They were extremely hot, and they couldn't be sold across the country for people's palates that weren't used to those peppers. So what Garcia does, and he begins his experiments about 5 years after he returns from Cornell, and he's now teaching by that time, and he's a professor, and he's also running the experiment station. He begins to crossbreed peppers, meaning I always try to say this. My sons even know this. They're 10 and 7, and they've heard me say this so many times, so I have practiced it. When you have in species, in angiosperms, species with seeds, right? You have pollen and seeds, and you can crossbreed them. Okay, so if you introduce different seeds and different pollen from different plants, you get different genetic process, and so the genetic possibilities are kind of endless. Garcia and his proteges gather peppers from Chihuahua, Sonora, New Mexico, Arizona, I think even California, maybe Baja California, and he just starts crossbreeding them to see what he ends up with. And what he ends up with is a pepper that is longer and more uniform, more mild as to appeal to Anglo tastes. And the important thing is it's long, uniform, and easy to can, because that's what they did. They canned chili peppers. And so what he does is he allows for the commercial selling of the plant. And it doesn't really take off during his lifetime, but after his lifetime, there's a chili pepper boom. Now, here's the cool thing. That's the story of the chili pepper is the story of Garcia himself. He's a product of the borderlands. He encountered all kinds of different pollinators during his life, and he emerges as the chili pepper king who changes the landscape of the borderlands.
It's incredible.
That is really a great analogy, I think, that he changed it. Was he ever married?
He was. He married an elite elite Anglo family, Julieta Amador, the Amador family, Amador Street. NMSU has a collection of their love letters when he was courting her from 1906 to 1908, and they are spicy too. The chapter I'm working right now, it's chapter 5. It's called Chili Peppers, and it's at the same time he's crossbreeding chili peppers. He has a spicy love life too. So, Julieta was sick though. She had tuberculosis, and so she spent a lot of time in hospitals and everywhere from Albuquerque and El Paso and Juarez. And so the love letters reflect him writing to her when she was sick, and he loved her so much. And just some of this language is so flowery, just, you're the light of my life. And I mean, most of the time he's just a scientist, right? And so these love letters give an insight into a different world that he inhabited in his personal life. They were married in 1908. They take a honeymoon to Niagara Falls. But then she's really sick. They have a child that doesn't make it past a year old. This is part of his tragic personal life story that began in Chihuahua. Eventually, she dies in 1920, and he's heartbroken. And I just discovered Dennis Daly, the head the head of the archives at MSU, showed me this letter that he found from 1920, and he basically was so devastated. He said, "I don't think I can go on. I don't want to live anymore. Julieta's gone. She was the love of my life."
Oh, how sad.
It's tremendously sad, and he never marries again.
Oh,
Wow.
that's sweet. What inspired you personally to research Fabian Garcia?
Like I said at the beginning, I've always been interested in finding interesting avenues to explore the place I live so I can get other people interested in history. I couldn't believe I learned about Garcia just reading about history or from I don't remember how I first encountered his name, but a former professor at NMSU, Bill Eman, gave me a stack of papers that were all the agricultural bulletins that Garcia published. And he was working on a different project related to tuberculosis and such, and he kind of got interested in Garcia. Bill, if you're listening, what's up? So he gave me the stack of papers. I started reading, and I said, "Why has nobody written a biography on this amazing individual?" That was 10 years ago about, and I've just continued to read and read and read and read and read and write and write and write. And it took me 7 or 8 years to have that aha moment where I realized he transformed. He wasn't just the chili pepper guy; he was a lot more. So his story is infectious, and I love sharing it, and I hope that you guys will help me share it.
That's the idea of this podcast, sharing history,
Yeah,
preserving history and democracy. That's our theme.
absolutely. Speaking of, did you find any records in our vaults about Fabian Garcia?
I did. I found a record of his marriage to Julieta Amador. Just as you said, that was kind of cool to find it, though. And the printing on it is just amazing. Jacob, you'll show it to our guests. We also found a warranty deed where he is mentioned as a widower. And that's just so sad. It was not a single man. He was a widower. Now, I did see a sign when I was driving on University, something new with Fabian Garcia. Do you know anything about that? Do you know?
So that's the Fabian Garcia Science Center on the other side of the highway on University.
Oh, okay.
He owned lots of property across the Mesilla Valley. His house, I was in your office last spring or fall, I can't remember, and I came across the deed to his house, which was like 101 Water Street, right downtown. I think the structure is still there. I need to do a bit more research. A colleague of mine, Jerry Wallace, and I were working on that. It was a lot of fun. I want to say something about university, though, that I've been playing around with as I write the conclusion to the book at the same time I'm finishing up the chapters. If you go down to, what's the name of that brewery in Mesilla? The Red Dog? Is there a Red Dog brewery?
Yeah.
Spotted Dog?
Spotted Dog.
Spotted Dog. I love thinking about this, okay? If you start at the Spotted Dog and you head up University, I think that's University, or it's a state road and becomes University. That'll take you all the way to A Mountain, past A Mountain, the Oregon Mountains. And and Garcia lived in Mesilla, And when he rode his horse up that street, which was a dirt path in the 1890s, he would have passed um, various elevations and the botanical species of those elevations. So you have Mesilla, and it's by the river, and there's a lot more water, and you have pecan trees and such. But as you get higher in elevation, you have creosote, prickly pears, and you get higher, you have ocotillos. And so, in other words, the vegetation changed as he saw the changing vegetation as he went to school and work every day. But if you start there today and walk up University or ride up University, there are remnants. You start in the pecan orchards. He introduced a pecan variety that transformed the region.
Wow, I didn't know that.
There are still cotton fields. Right at University by Spotted Dog, and there's old cotton mills there. He introduced a cotton variety that transformed the valley. You continue up University to Mesilla Park. It's one of the areas in the Mesilla Valley with the oldest introduced vegetation. He introduced that vegetation where the neighborhood is today. Just past Mesilla Park, you have the Fabian Garcia Science Center. That was his land and property. And then finally, if you go a little bit further, you end up at the Seed House, which is the original building on campus. That was his office for most of his career. It's still there. And just past the Seed House is where he planted his first chili peppers on the college farm. In other words, a walk up University is a walk up Garcia's life and the visible explanation in the physical real world of how he changed this place.
That's incredible.
That is incredible. And thank you for putting it in such a way that we can visually see those plants as he walks. It's
Next time I'm driving down that area, I'm going to be like, oh, there's this and this and this. So that's pretty awesome. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So you're from Colorado now. You live in Colorado now. Would you say Colorado chili's better or New Mexico chili's better?
My buddy and I just went and got chili. We got Hatch chili. Come on.
Yes, always. It's always going to be the best. I'm glad you can admit that too, because I mean, we have a lot of people from Colorado say it's the best, and gotta say I disagree.
I've never tried Colorado chili, so
yeah,
it's not something I see in the market here. So
there's a reason
I've
it's
never
called
tried
Hatch.
it. Yeah, but we can thank Fabian Garcia for. Wow, that's amazing that when I was in New York, there was a time of year that we got chilies from Hatch, and I remember taking pictures of that sign because I didn't know where Hatch was and I wanted to look it up. And lo and behold, here I am.
Yeah.
It's kind of small world. Yeah, it's a very small world.
Oh, cool.
But I imagine Hatch would not be Hatch without Fabian Garcia, huh?
Absolutely. So all the chili varieties that are the Hatch variety, New Mexico varieties, they're all strands or varietals that come from the chili that he crossbred and released in the early part of the 20th century. They all go back to Garcia, all the New Mexican varieties.
Well, I know you said you wanted to make him part of our history and textbooks or because of his contributions, but I did find a newspaper article where Fabian Garcia, prominent researcher based in Mesilla Valley, inducted into the National Agricultural Hall of Fame. I thought that was pretty cool.
First Hispanic individual. Amazing. I was writing a paragraph about that this morning because for an article I'm writing. He, in this day and age, like the media cycles go quickly and it's kind of like a fleeting piece. We don't know too much about him. But his story is so important for New Mexicans. It's important for Hispanic people. It's important for Mexicans. It's important for American history. I mean, you got Hatch chili in New York, right?
Yes.
And so I was just thinking about I was just reading up on the same article probably that you have because it's so important. But then it also makes you ask yourself, how can he be the only Hispanic individual inducted into the American Agricultural Hall of Fame? What is wrong with us? I mean, that's part of this, what I want to change the story to. A lot of people know George Washington Carver in the South as the famous agriculturalist who's Black. They know Liberty Hyde Bailey, maybe. And so I want people to associate Garcia with the Southwestern borderlands and just blast out that story of how he was inducted into the Agricultural Hall of Fame.
Well, how close are we to getting that book?
Oh, you're not supposed to ask me that.
They didn't tell me.
It's going to be a while. It's when writing a second book is different for an academic historian, because the first book you have a dissertation from your PhD work, and so you already have material to go with. And this time it's like it's my book to write, but I'm not defending it as a dissertation, but I'm also like my own harshest critic, and so it's just taking a long time because I want it to be perfect. But I promise it's going to be fire when it's ready.
Great.
I love that pun. How do you think the university still honors Fabian Garcia?
They bring me down to give talks. No, I'm just there are several landmarks named after Garcia Hall, Garcia Annex. There is the Chili Pepper Institute, and when I worked for NMSU, I became good friends with Paul Bosland, who used to run the Chili Pepper Institute. And so he did a good job, and they do a good job of talking up Garcia as much as they can. And I would say even like the last big talk I gave, I think the one that Bern that you saw that was recorded,
right?
There was a ton of folks that came from agricultural extension, and they know his story well. And in fact, they helped me collaborate. I didn't know, for example, that until someone talked to me after I gave that talk, that Garcia introduced an onion variety. That's like, okay, well, whatever, an onion variety. But it's part of his story. He studied and imported an onion from Spain, crossbred it, and now it's the most popular grown onion from Florida to California. Garcia did that. So your onions go back to Garcia too.
That is really amazing that we don't know the impact of this man.
Yeah.
So that's got to change.
I think like growing up, I'm from Las Cruces, born and raised, and I would always hear the name Fabian Garcia, but I mean, I didn't really know much about him until, I started working here even.
Right.
So it's pretty crazy that we don't get taught that at schools.
When I first moved here, we went to the Farm and Ranch Museum.
Yeah.
And they have little tidbits about certain people. And he was one of the names, so that was my first introduction to him. But I hadn't eaten hatch chili peppers in New York. I only ate them when I got here, and they were way too spicy at the beginning for me. Just my palate was not ready. And now it's like, bring it on. I will not eat a hamburger without green chili on it.
I agree.
That's my new standard.
It's addictive.
It is.
I compare it, the old book by Frank, or the film too, Dune. There's like the planet Dune and the spice that you get addicted to. Chili pepper's the same. You can't live without it. Once you have it, you can't live without it.
Everything feels so mild and tasteless.
Plain,
and, shout out to the Irish community again, where salt is basically your only spice. This is such a pleasure in my late age to find this new palette I have,
We love it. It's never too late.
It's never too late, no. I just want to thank you so much for sharing the knowledge with us and coming on. And I know you were sick for a little bit, and thanks for hanging in there and getting better and showing up for us. It's a great topic.
It's been a pleasure to chat with you too.
Of course, we'll need to have you back again once the book's ready as well. So
sounds awesome.
This episode was hosted by myself, Communications Coordinator Cynthia Mendoza, and our producer Bernadine Caparel, and produced and edited by our editor Jacob Slaughter behind the camera. Thanks again for joining us, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at daclerk@donianacounty.org. We'll see you next time.